The judges humiliated the little girl for being black, but she silenced them when she sang. "With all due respect, dear, are you sure you're in the right place?" Judge Harrison's question echoed through the luxurious auditorium of the National Talent Academy like a resounding slap. "This is a competition for promising young artists." Ruby Johnson, just 13 years old, stood firm in the center of the lit stage, holding the microphone with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a restrained anger that few could control with such dignity. Around her, the other 50 participating children whispered among themselves, some clearly embarrassed, others trying to hide cruel giggles. "Yes, ma'am. I'm exactly where I need to be," she replied in a soft voice that contrasted with the fire in her dark eyes. Judge Campbell, sitting majestically at the head table, didn't even bother to look up from her notes. "Well, then show us what you've brought. We hope it's appropriate for the level of this institution." The third judge, Mr. Montgomery, whispered something to his colleagues that elicited discreet smiles, but audible enough for Ruby to hear fragments like "realistic" and "don't get your hopes up." Ruby had grown up in the East Oak neighborhood, where the sound of freight trains mingled with nighttime sirens and where opportunities like this simply didn't exist for girls like her. Her mother, a nurse who worked 3 shifts, had saved every penny for 2 years to pay for the registration fee for this national competition that promised a full scholarship to the most prestigious music conservatory in the country. "What song did you choose?" Harrison asked with an impatient sigh, as if he already knew he was wasting his time. "Amazing Grace," Ruby replied, completely ignoring the surprised looks from the other competitors. It was a risky choice, a song traditionally associated with the civil rights struggle, sung in churches for generations, completely outside the classical repertoire expected in that elitist environment. "How interesting," Campbell muttered, finally looking up. "Well, let's get this over with." At that moment, as the spotlights burned her skin and prejudiced whispers filled the air around her, Ruby closed her eyes for a moment. Her grandmothers had sung this song during historic marches. Her great-grandmother had sung it in the cotton fields. And now, she would sing it on that stage where she was clearly not welcome. What those judges didn't know was that Ruby hadn't gotten there by chance or luck. In recent weeks, she had discovered something about the National Talent Academy that would change everything, information she kept as a secret trump card, waiting for just the right moment to use it. When she opened her eyes again, there was a dangerous serenity in her gaze that made Mr. Montgomery pause his half-smile. It was the kind of calm that only exists in those who have weathered much worse storms and discovered that they possess a power far greater than anyone could imagine. If this story of prejudice and overcoming adversity touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a moment of humiliation would turn into something those judges would never forget. But as Ruby prepared to sing, Judge Campbell did something that made everyone's blood run cold. She openly pulled out her cell phone and started typing, as if the girl's performance were too irrelevant to deserve attention. Mr. Montgomery sighed loudly, glanced at his watch, and muttered to Harrison, "How long do we have to pretend we're evaluating?" "Amazing Grace, what a predictable choice," Harrison commented, not even bothering to lower his voice. "It's always the same with these kinds of candidates. They think a song with emotional history will make up for their lack of classical technique." Ruby felt every word like a knife, but it wasn't the first time. Throughout her life, she had faced similar comments. At school, where teachers expressed surprise when she got high grades. At the supermarket, where security guards discreetly followed her through the aisles. And now here, in the place where her voice should speak for itself, where talent should be the only currency accepted. What those judges didn't know was that Ruby had grown up in the Mount Sinai Baptist Church choir, directed by her grandmother Dorothy, a woman who had sung on gospel tours in the 1970s and taught 3 generations of children that music was more than entertainment. It was resistance, it was strength, it was survival. Every Sunday, Ruby would climb onto that small makeshift stage and sing for a congregation that loved her unconditionally, that shouted "Amen" and "Sing Girl" when her voice hit impossible notes. "You can start whenever you're ready," Campbell said without looking up from his cell phone. "But make it quick. We have more promising candidates to evaluate." It was then that Ruby remembered her mother's words from the night before. "Honey, sometimes God puts you in places where you're not welcome precisely because He needs someone to show those places how wrong they are." But there was something else. 3 weeks earlier, while researching the National Talent Academy for her application, Ruby had discovered something that left her speechless. In the institution's publicly available online archives, she found the records of winners from the last 20 years. In 2 decades, only 2 black candidates had been selected, and both in years when the Academy was facing lawsuits for racial discrimination. Even more revealing, she had discovered that Mr. Montgomery, one of the judges now looking at her with disdain, had a son who had been rejected in a similar audition 3 years earlier at another institution, and he had filed a lawsuit alleging bias against white middle-class applicants. The lawsuit was documented in the courts, with Montgomery arguing that forced diversity had hurt his son's chances. Ruby also discovered something about Judge Campbell that would change everything. But that would have to wait for the right moment. "We're waiting," Harrison said, drumming his fingers on the table with irritating impatience. At that moment, Ruby closed her eyes and mentally transported herself to Mount Sinai. She could hear her grandmother's voice. "When you sing to God, child, you are singing with the power of all who came before you. Let them sing through you." When she opened her eyes, there was something different about her posture. No longer the nervous girl who had entered that auditorium, but someone who carried centuries of music, resilience, and strength in her voice. "I'm going to sing now," Ruby said, her voice echoing with an authority that finally made Campbell look up from his cell phone. What those 3 judges didn't know was that they were about to witness not just an audition, but the beginning of something that would forever change the reputation of the National Academy of Talent. Ruby hadn't come there just to sing, she had come to seek justice. And every note she was about to sing carried not only her voice, but the strength of an entire community that had been systematically excluded from those stages. Each new humiliation only strengthened something inside her that her oppressors couldn't see, a silent force fueled by the very injustice they tried to impose, growing like a storm they should never have provoked. "I'm going to sing now," Ruby said, but something in the way her words echoed through the auditorium made Judge Campbell finally look up from her phone. There was a strange authority in that young voice, not teenage defiance, but something far more dangerous. Absolute confidence. Mr. Montgomery chuckled softly. "Make it quick, dear. It's already 5:30, and I have an important dinner." He turned to Harrison and whispered loudly enough for Ruby to hear, "At least when this is over, we can congratulate ourselves for giving diversity a chance. The Ethics Committee will be pleased with our numbers." Ruby closed her eyes for a moment. 3 weeks of meticulous research had revealed much more than she had initially imagined. The discovery about Montgomery's lawsuit was just the beginning. The real bombshell was related to Judge Campbell. 2 weeks earlier, Ruby had found a 1995 newspaper article buried in the digital archives of the municipal library. The headline was devastating: "Music Professor Fired for Plagiarizing Students' Compositions." The black and white photo showed a much younger woman, but one unmistakably recognizable as Margaret Campbell. For 5 years, she had stolen original compositions from her college students and registered them under her own name, building an entire academic career based on other people's talents. But Ruby had much more than an old article. She had recordings. 2 nights before the audition, Ruby had arrived early at the academy to practice. In fact, she had set up a small tape recorder, borrowed from her journalist cousin Marcus, in the auditorium, hidden under one of the front row chairs. What she captured over the next 2 hours would change everything. Campbell, Harrison, and Montgomery had gathered for a pre-selection, openly discussing how they would manipulate the results. "We need at least one black person in the semifinals," Campbell said with casual disdain. "Enough to show that we're inclusive, but not enough for them to actually win." "What about that little girl from East Oak?" Harrison asked. "Ruby something?" "She won't make it past the first round," Montgomery replied with arrogant certainty. "I'll personally make sure she understands her place." But there was more. Campbell had made a confession that sealed his fate. "My reputation has been carefully rebuilt. I won't allow some kid from the projects to threaten it again. I've destroyed promising careers before, and I'll do it again if necessary." Ruby was not alone in her preparation. Dr. Williams, director of the Mount Sinai Choir and retired professor of civil rights at Howard University, had become her mentor and strategic ally when she shared her findings with him. "Child," he had said, reviewing the evidence Ruby had compiled, "you didn't just come here to sing. You came here to seek justice." Dr. Williams had used his contacts to verify every piece of information Ruby had uncovered. He confirmed that Campbell had never been formally investigated for plagiarism because her victims, young students without resources at the time, had been intimidated into silence. But now, with Ruby's recordings and the records he had helped locate, they had irrefutable evidence of a pattern of behavior that had been destroying talent for decades. "What do you plan to do?" Dr. Williams had asked. Ruby smiled with a serenity that belied her age. I'm going to sing for them, Dr. Williams. I'm going to sing like they've never heard before. And then I'll show them who they really are. As the judges waited impatiently, Ruby discreetly opened her bag and checked that the small transmitter was working. Dr. Williams was outside, recording everything in real time, ready to send the evidence to media contacts who were already waiting. But Ruby had saved the best for last. Hidden in the lining of her bag was a letter from 1995, written in Campbell's own hand to the dean of the university where she worked,